We're going to come back to the interspirituality word again. Have you heard each of them mention some guy called Reb Zalman? Have you heard that a couple times? A number of you know exactly who that is, but not everybody does. And you seem also both to know him. And I phrased this question carefully, but it is, how did each of you meet Reb Zalman, and who was he to you? Because he is now not in this life. Yes? True? So you want to lead on this one? How did you meet him?
Sure. So I first met Reb Zalman in his doctoral thesis. He went to my seminary for his doctorate. And Reb Zalman is a chassid with the shtreimel and the side curls and all that. But he went to the Reform College, Hebrew Union College, and that's where he did his doctorate. And he wrote a 2-volume work on Hasidic counseling techniques. And no one read it. It was in the stacks. But I went up, I got it, blew the dust off it, and I was totally mesmerized. And then when I graduated, I came to Miami. I started a congregation in Miami, Florida, and I discovered that in Fort Lauderdale, there was a rabbi who brought Zalman in to the greater Miami area, Fort Lauderdale area, and he would do seminars only for rabbis. It was a private thing. So I started studying with him that way. And just a little bit more. So then, after a couple of years of that, I brought him to my congregation. And he came with his big fur hat, and he took his side curls, which he oftentimes put behind his ear. He let them come all the way down the side of his face. And he came to the congregation, and he taught. And everyone was very polite. And when he left, my congregation said, "Never bring him back again." They were so frightened by the Hasidic look. They couldn't even hear what he said.
That's kind of how my congregation felt about you, by the way.
And that's why they never brought me back, okay.
And I met Reb Zalman maybe around the same time. What year was it? Okay, I met him right around the same time. He was still a chassid, kind of fresh from what's it called? Chabad. And I was living on my own in Mendocino, California, ran away from home in Taos, New Mexico. My parents didn't really notice, but I did. And I was living, I was 16, I was living in Mendocino, and Reb Zalman showed up because he was a teacher of a friend of mine who later became a rabbi, Yehuda Fine. He'd call the Times Square rabbi. And Reb Zalman got a hold of me and said, "You are a Jew who has strayed from the flock. Everything you're looking for in Hinduism and Buddhism and Sufism," at that point I was already one of each of those, "is available to you in Judaism. You need look no further. And moreover, you must come back. All Jews are needed." And that I was 16, and that totally turned me off. So I ran the other direction. Although I did spend a few weekends with him at the Aquarian Minion in Berkeley and Oakland, enough time that something of my teenage resistance melted. And I had an experience with Zalman that I've written about in the book, How Do You Pray? Are you in that book? You're in that book too. How Do You Pray by Celeste Jacoboni. She collected very short essays from a variety of teachers and artists and activists about their relationship to prayer. And I wrote about my story with Zalman at that time, where he did melt my resistance in that he spoke about prayer as something that happens to you rather than something you do. And that night when I went to bed on the floor of somebody's house in Berkeley, 16 years old, fell asleep, woke up in the middle of the night with the sense of being prayed through by the beloved. And it changed everything for me. And so then years later, I made my way back to Zalman's embrace and became good friends with his 5th or 6th wife, Eve. Oh, and he also slept with my first husband's ex-wife for a little while, and they came and visited us.
What is it about spiritual masters, you know?
I know.
Chogyam Trungpa, I mean,
But they were open about it.
Very lively, yeah, and honest.
Honest.
For those of you for whom Reb Zalman is not familiar, I associate him as one of the founders of the Jewish Renewal Movement.
He's the one.
And I think that has something to do with why people who identify with their Jewishness are also comfortable in a setting like this. It sounds to me, from your stories, he's in there somewhere.
Because he was a sheikh. He was a Sufi sheikh. He was ordained by a Zen Roshi in some capacity as a lay Zen teacher. What else, Rami? Christian, definitely.
Is this during the fur hat?
A little
and
later.
A little later,
but not
That's-
much. Not much.
He always had the payas, the side curls. They always wore the fur hat when he wanted to. I went with him to synagogue one Saturday. When I would visit, he would only go to Chabad synagogue, because if he went to the synagogues of his Hasidim, his disciples, they would fight over who gets him. So he said, I'm not going to any of you. I'm going back to my roots in Chabad. And I went with him, and we'd go way before the service would start. So the rabbi wasn't there, and he would walk in, and he would say, who wants to learn? And everyone would come, and he would teach, women and men, which Chabad doesn't do. And they would all be together, and then there was a lookout on the window. The rabbi's coming! And the women would go behind their side, and the men would go on their side. And then he would have Hershey's Kisses, which are kosher chocolate, in his long kaftan, in the pockets. And the little kids would run over to him, and they'd say, Zaidi, grandfather, give us some chocolate. And he would pull a book down because the synagogue was in the library. He'd pull a book down, and he'd say, you read this and come back, and I'll give you chocolate. The service in Chabad goes on for, 20 hours or something. And he's feeding them chocolate and more chocolate. And they're getting wilder and wilder. And I keep saying, what would you like me to read? I'd like some chocolate. No chocolate for me. I've got zillions of Zalman stories I could tell you.
Yeah, and what occurs to me, for those of you, again, who'd like to read a lovely book, period, called Jesus Through Jewish Eyes. It was edited by Beatrice Bruteau, if I got that right. But he has an essay in there, and I think you do too. But it's a wonderful book I required in actually a class for seminarians called The Other Jesus, as people got to know how Jesus shows up for good and sometimes for ill in other traditions. But that's a lovely book, Jesus Through Jewish Eyes, where you can read an essay by Reb Zalman. I feel deprived never to have met him. And
Holy
yet,
envy.
yeah, see?
Available at the bookstore.
This is how it looks.